And two of my favorite social workers are here today as our first guests, so I'm super excited. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and starting with Dr. Claire Ford Green.
So I'm Dr. Claire Greenford, and
Thank you.
You're good. And I am the Executive Director for the National Association of Social Workers, and I have been in that role for about 10 months. I mostly identify with my Caribbean heritage, so I'm from Barbados, and I think my lens comes from that because I did not grow up in this country. Most of my formative years were in the Caribbean, and then coming here and having an understanding as I've gotten older about oppression and about the ways that systematically we continue to be held down has been traumatic, liberating, and traumatic at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our second guest is TC. Introduce yourself more formally.
Hi, my name is Terrance Coffie. I'm the Community Affairs Liaison for an organization called the Doe Fund that focuses on providing transitional services to men who are formerly incarcerated. I'm a graduate of New York University, also an adjunct lecturer here where I teach forensic justice and problem-solving course. And, just in thinking about this conversation that we're going to have today, it was interesting to hear the doctor explain her perception of through the lens that she sees this country, our system, et cetera, as opposed to me. I grew up in poverty. I grew up in this country, and I grew up in a concept or a belief as Tupac. I'm a big Tupac fan, and one of the songs he said that was real interesting to me, he said, "That's just the way it is." Yeah. It's the internalization of a way of being or system that we live in that was just somehow normalized. Yeah. So hopefully today, as we have these conversations, we can begin to really dab into these things. And one shout out I have to say, I was just named a 2019 honoree by the Made Man Foundation. So I'm feeling myself so much.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think even, when we talk about anti-oppressive practice, right, two things that you've already mentioned is so important. I definitely feel the contribution of Caribbean folks to even, like the American struggle, right? I think about, so much of, the movements were, like whether it was Marcus Garvey or whether it was like the Haitian Revolution and that impact, right? And we often, try to make this like it's only something in America, right? Like resistance is America specific, but realize that there's so much, even what has shaped our resistance has been through, our brothers and sisters struggling throughout the world, struggling throughout the diaspora, especially folks in the Caribbean. The second piece is that I feel we often don't ever celebrate ourselves, right? Like part of the system is that we never pause to even acknowledge or celebrate ourselves. So yes, my brother, like so much like congratulations. Not only that, but as you've you've graduated from NYU, you've brought these conversations into so many spaces. And even before we started the show, you were giving us this breakdown of like your class tonight, right? Yes. And the intentionality in which you bring yourself into your space is so much a part of what, like anti-oppressive practice in this work needs to be. So thank you. I'm super excited to have you both. You're folks that have immense wisdom and brilliance that I feel like will be able to help people to think about these issues with greater intentionality. And when we talk about anti-oppressive practice, right, specifically as it relates to social work, it almost feels like it's a quagmire, right? Because we're a profession that is rooted in social justice. So the fact that we're now talking about anti-oppressive social work, that there's like problems there, right? So that's a conversation within itself, right? But yet it just feels that we're not good at moving theory to practice. So I figured for today we would talk about, for someone that is new to this conversation or for someone that is having this conversation, like what does anti-oppressive practice look like in praxis? Meaning like how do we move theory to action? And what does that look like on a personal level? And, I've had to think about, even for myself, that's something that I think about consistently, right? I think about the impact of trauma and the impact of trauma for not only myself but oppressed people in the world, and why this is so important to even consider like anti-oppressive practice on a personal level, as we often think about oppression outside of ourselves, right? But to think about our experiences in these systems, we talk about like migration. Migration is harmful. Like, why did we migrate, right? We migrated because our countries were destabilized, right? So the poverty of migration and the trauma of migrating to a country, a space in which you would never fit in, right? So there's so much trauma there. I also think about, lately when I think about anti-oppressive practice, and I kind of cued that in the beginning, is even identification, right? I think of James Baldwin and I'm Not Your Negro. And ultimately what he was saying that like, I'm not only am I not your Negro, but I'm not this classification in which you've made of me, right? So I think about like name, and Kirk isn't my name, James isn't my name, right? These are names that were that are rooted in oppression, right? Like, why did my family feel it okay to name me a European name, right? Because this was how they felt I would be able to fit into a European society.
But
Why?
this is also, not to cut you off, this is also one of the practices that we see from other minority communities when we think of the Japanese or the Asian community, that I would have students or classmates who shared that they were given these American names in order for them to fit in, even though those names still did not so much connect them to the system in which they were trying to fit in, because their complexion, their ethnicity, all of it was still different from that. But that was another where we also see that practice.
No, that's a great piece. I feel from my students, and what, so much of even my own conception of that has come from, my students, right? And specifically like my Asian students are like, don't, worry about pronouncing my name. Here's my American name. And I'm like, no,
exactly.
Let me struggle with pronouncing your name. Let me try to pronounce your name. Let me honor who you are, right? So I feel so much of anti-oppressive practice really starts with ourselves, looking at ways in which we've internalized oppression, like look at ways in which we've been identified by oppression, and beginning to create our own healing as well as our own identification.
Well, and in regards to that, and that's another aspect that I've struggled with, is specifically when I think of groups who have migrated to the United States, as opposed to African Americans who were brought. It wasn't like a choice was given. We're going to migrate to the United States for this idea of freedom, wherever that looks like. And I don't know why this stands out to me a lot when I'm coming in and I look over at the Statue of Liberty and what it should represent and what its true meaning is and what does it mean to other groups coming in. Because I never, as an African American, I didn't have that experience. We don't have that.
We didn't come through.
We didn't come through that type of experience. So that's another area where I think that it's important that specifically for African Americans, when we're trying to roll back these layers of who we are, when it's almost as if it's difficult because we're tied to the very system in which we, it's like you were planted in a ground and you came up through this ground and you're trying to disconnect with the soil that you're from, because the soil is also saturated with racism and oppression and marginalization. So it's almost embedded. So I think I expressed to you earlier before we came in as where I was at Otisville Correctional Institution, and I was speaking with men in regards to criminal justice reform and policy and all these things, and they expressed some of these views that were almost contradictory to what we see in advocacy, or we see that's happening here. And as a point that you made, that that's a part of that internalization of saying, okay, I'm a bad person because I'm here and I'm in this space, and this acceptance of that. And I say that, and the reason why it struck me is because I remember myself during my own years of incarceration feeling that same thing, like somehow I didn't fit into a system which I was grown in. It's like I'm a flower in this pot that I really don't belong, but I'm in the pot, and that's where we go into the confusion and the importance of really beginning to structure our curriculum and what we see at an academic level that really
Yeah.
directly speaks to that. And there's really no
Yeah.
curriculum. It's easier.
But what has allowed you to move out? Before we go there,
Okay.
right? Like, what's allowed you to, to make those adjustments, right? Because, again, like, people who have had your experiences don't end up at NYU. They don't end up teaching classes. They don't end up,
NSAW Student of the Year.
yeah, they don't become executives, right? So I think so much I want to really kind of focus on is like what's allowed you to navigate, these systems, whether they're externally or internally. Like what's allowed you to, to really navigate and to not only navigate but to really succeed.
Initially, and I share this in a lot of spaces I'm in. When I initially was released, the one thing that pushed me forward in spite of everything, I was a bit older. My life had reached a point of exhaustion, so to speak. And my commitment when I initially started in the Doe Fund was not so much about that I believed that I would fit in this system or this would work. It was none of the things that I understand now. It was just it was a pure fact of fear of going back into a cage. Period. A lot of what I'm expressing now is what you hear. I think again, you guys probably hear me reference Tupac a lot when he said he'll die. He would die in a bloody bath before he went back. That concentrated experience of incarcerate. I mean, it is brought there. What we're discussing happens on a societal level.
Yeah.
Broader. There is put directly in your face, and you see it and you live it and you breathe it in and day and you see it every day.
It's condensed oppression.
Yes. In its purest form.
Absolutely.
And that is what we hear a lot when we think of our young man, or you hear the songs, or you hear that expression that I'll die before I go back. Now think about that. I would die before I go back. Go back to what? That you would leave this place called life to escape that
level of dehumanization.
Right.
Absolutely.
That's what did it. And as I transitioned through, it really began to be the influence of individuals I began to see that gave me a different perspective of who I was in the space called life. And I have to say it like that. And a lot of the things that happened were initially out of a sense of fear of going back to what I like call the dark place.
Yeah.
Period. And it was only as I transitioned through these various experiences that I was having along the way that Jay-Z said, we take the same drive and passion, we just aiming at something else. And that's what I did. I took that same passion and drive that I had in the streets when I grind, when I did whatever it was, but now I just put it with something else. And along the way, I began to meet individuals such as yourself that helped redefine my perception of myself. And that's what really happened along the way, to be perfectly honest with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think that so much of what you're talking about is the collective trauma that we also experience, right? So when we're talking about the dehumanization of our people, the long-standing history and continuing dehumanization of our people, I've spoken about this before, and I say, particularly in our space when we talk about clinical terms, it's not post-traumatic stress disorder because we're still living it.
Yeah.
We've never escaped it. And even if we're not physically in a prison, we are still imprisoned mentally. There are places that we know that we cannot go because of how we will be treated. I've been mistreated by various sectors here, and living in America. And I think the last 8 years for me have really been an awakening. I know being in social work school, being told you don't understand oppression. But that was true, because having my formative years in the Caribbean, I came here as an early teen, but my formative years, I grew up with people that looked like me. While my family was of different orientations, in American context of different orientations, I wasn't really aware that they were. We do have colorism in the Caribbean, and we do have those issues. That's very real. But I also came from a people where, one of our statues in Barbados, Bussa, is a slave who led a revolt against, being enslaved during slavery in Barbados, much of the Caribbean slavery is very heavily tied to our sugarcane production and our plantations. But that sense of pride, that sense of you can do anything you want to do, was instilled in me from a child. And so coming to America, I did not have that concept that I couldn't.
Yeah.
And experiencing the isms and racism, even though I experienced it, I didn't see it through that lens because my formative years didn't teach me that. But as I got older and had the experiences on MTA being told, you people don't go to a particular place I was going to, on Metro North, sorry, I was on a train and conductor took my ticket and said, you people don't go here, and what that does, being frozen, even in the role I currently have, I have so many people of color that come up to me and tell me what that means for them to have me represent them. And whether or not they are of the African diaspora, I've had many people come up to me who identify because this minority is in this role. And that's a lot of pressure and weight. So when you were talking about the oppression and being in that space, I also talked about what the weight is that we carry. We don't get the privilege of individuality. We have to carry the collective pain of our community, because no matter where we go, the same conversation is in our spheres. My sister circle, or as I call them, my magical Black girl sister circle, this is what we talk about every day. Literally, their text messages from this morning, beyond happy birthdays and I love yous, is about the fatigue and the exhaustion, about navigating spaces that dehumanize us when we're trying to add humanity to it because of who's being served and impacted by those systems. It's us. And the frustration that we feel working in the social service sectors and recognizing white supremacy being embedded in every aspect of it. You talked about our field being founded on anti-oppressive practices, and we're talking about it, but our field was founded by well-to-do rich white women that didn't have a need for money. And even when we talked about our field, when we go back to Boy and we talk about the talented 10 and we talk about early social work, there was always a division between those communities of color and those social workers of color and social workers who were not of color, and the difference in the systems. And we're talking about the early 1900s when this really started. And we're still talking about that. We're still talking about division in our social service sectors, our laws that are inherently biased towards men, that are inherently biased towards communities of color, our healthcare system, our educational system, our criminal injustice system, all of these different things that we continue to talk about. And yet we're now supposed to be working through this to help others while we are also going through this. And, you and I talked about this last summer because I'd called you and a colleague and I writing an article around this, and we're still working on that. We got it back and we're doing some more edits to really talk about what this is like to be a person of color navigating this space and frustrated and overwhelmed, and yet having a duty to our community to address it while we also go through that too. So I think that this conversation, and I'm so grateful that you guys have shared about this as well as your journey, but knowing that we can't do this journey alone and we don't get the option to do that. It is still being told I am articulate in a meeting in March celebrating social work, where someone thought coming up to me and telling me I was articulate was helpful. And I literally froze. And in your mind, you have this thing that if somebody says this, what your response is, and then when it happens, you just freeze because there's a point of disbelief that it just happened. And it's not as though it's the first time. And it's almost a surprise, and I know someone mentioned, about my degrees, and they're like, oh, you have 4 degrees? And I was like, yep. Needs a whole bunch of student loans. They're like, well, how'd you do that? Do you ask other person how they've done that? Why is this an anomaly? I am not an anomaly. To be a doctoral level social worker or a person of color is not an anomaly. There's a whole bunch of me's that exist. And we continue to devalue that, and as though it is an othering rather than our strengths. Our field continues to focus on the narrative of oppression, the narrative of sexifying, as I call it, all of the negatives, the have-nots, and we don't do this. Our communities are 4 times more likely to do this, 4 times more likely to do this. Our men are in jail. But we don't talk about our collective strengths. We don't talk about the collective unity and power that we have. We don't talk about the fact that, as I've experienced because of the realities of being a woman of color and young woman of color in this field, young woman of color who's an immigrant in this field with a doctorate, and what that means, the sisters that I meet and the brothers that I meet along the way that say, I see you and I'm going to mentor you, and how I do that to others as well. This is something that is part of our DNA. Yes, it is bred. We've been grown in this soil, and we haven't gotten out of this soil because we don't have the power to have the shears to cut ourselves from the soil. And so I think that it is so critical to have this conversation, but move beyond critical conversation towards critical action, because I hold our field responsible for much of the isms that we have that perpetuated, particularly in our social service sectors.
So drop the mic.
Drop it.
Drop the mic. Boom, boom, boom.